The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, turning the air into shimmering waves of heat that made everything beyond 50 yards look like a mirage. Jake Morrison pulled his worn Stetson lower over his weathered face, squinting. Against the glare, as he guided his horse, Thunder, along the fence line of his sprawling ranch. At 62, Jake had been riding these same trails for over 4 decades, and every scar on the landscape told a story he knew by heart. The drought had been particularly brutal this year. His cattle clustered around the few remaining water sources, their ribs showing through dull coats. Jake's own reflection in the water troughs revealed a man carved from the same harsh elements as his land. Deep lines etched around steel-gray eyes, hands like leather from years of hard work, and a silence that had grown deeper with each passing year. Since his wife Sarah died 15 years ago, Thunder's ears suddenly pricked forward, and the horse snorted nervously. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle, holstered on his saddle, as he scanned the horizon. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against a boulder, barely visible in the shade. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, dismounting slowly. He approached, his heart clenched. It was a child, a Native American girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark hair was matted with dust, her small frame trembling despite the heat. Her clothes, a faded dress that had seen better days, hung loose on her tiny body. "Hey there, little one," Jake said softly, crouching down several feet away. The girl's eyes snapped open, large, dark eyes that held a depth of fear and pain that made Jake's chest tighten. She tried to scramble backward, but she was too weak. "It's okay," Jake continued, his voice gentle in a way it hadn't been in years. "I'm not going to hurt you. You look like you need some help." The girl's lips were cracked, and when she tried to speak, only a whisper came out. Jake could see she was severely dehydrated and hadn't eaten in days. Without hesitation, he reached for his water canteen. "Here," he said, moving slowly so as not to startle her, just small sips now. As she drank, Jake noticed the delicate silver bracelet around her wrist, traditional Native American craftsmanship. His mind raced with questions. Where had she come from? Where was her family? But those questions could wait. Right now, she needed immediate care. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jake asked as he helped her sit up straighter. "Ayanna," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ayanna," Jake repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "That's a beautiful name." "I'm Jake, can you? Tell me what happened to you." Tears began to stream down her dirt-stained cheeks. "They're gone," she said, her small voice breaking. "The fire, ... Everyone's gone." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard reports of a wildfire that had swept through the reservation lands to the east several days ago. Emergency crews had been working around the clock, but communication was spotty, and many families had been displaced. "Come on, Ayanna," Jake said, gently scooping her up in his arms. She was so light, it broke his heart. "Let's get you somewhere safe." As he carried her to his horse, Jake felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his own children had grown up and moved away. Thunder seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, standing perfectly still as Jake carefully mounted with Ayanna in his arms. The ride back to the ranch house was quiet, except for the soft sound of Ayanna's breathing against his chest. He found himself adjusting his hold on her, making sure she was comfortable, shielding her from the sun with his own body. It had been so long since he'd held a child, since he'd felt needed in this way. The ranch house, a modest 2-story building, with a wraparound porch, came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Jake had built it with his own hands 30 years ago, and while it showed signs of wear, it was sturdy and welcoming. As they approached, Ayanna stirred in his arms. "Is this your home?" she asked weakly. "Yes, darling," Jake replied, "and for now, it's yours too." Inside, Jake settled Ayanna on the couch in his living room, the same couch where he'd once read bedtime stories to his own children. He quickly prepared a simple meal, scrambled eggs, toast, and milk, nothing too heavy. For her empty stomach, as she ate slowly, Jake called the local sheriff's office and social services, reporting the situation. The responses were what he expected. They were overwhelmed with displaced families from the fire, and it would be several days before anyone could come out to assess the situation. "Looks like you'll be staying with me for a while," Jake told Ayanna after hanging up the phone. She looked up at him with those impossibly large eyes, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than fear. Jake made up the guest room that had once belonged to his daughter Emma. As he tucked Ayanna into the bed, she reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake felt his throat tighten. "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. You just rest now." As he turned off the light and closed the door softly behind him, Jake Morrison had no idea that this moment would change both of their lives forever. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. 3 months had passed since Jake found Ayanna, and the ranch had slowly come alive in ways he hadn't expected. The guest room was now unmistakably hers, adorned with drawings she'd made of horses and desert landscapes, a small collection of books from the local library, and the traditional Native American blanket that had been recovered from the fire. Sight, along with a few other belongings, the social services investigation had revealed the tragic truth. Ayanna's entire family had perished in the wildfire, and she had no living relatives willing or able to take her in. The reservation's resources were stretched thin, and many families were still rebuilding their own lives. When Jake offered to become her foster parent, the caseworker, Maria Santos, had been both surprised and relieved. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Morrison?" Maria had asked during one of her visits. "Raising a child is a big responsibility, especially one who's been through trauma." Jake had looked through the window at Ayanna, who was carefully brushing Thunder's coat in the corral. The horse, who had been skittish around strangers for years, stood perfectly still for her, occasionally nudging her gently with his nose. "Already made herself at home," Jake had said simply. "And I think we're good for each other." Now, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, Jake watched Ayanna from the porch as she practiced her reading under the old oak tree. She was a bright child, eager to learn, and surprisingly resilient. The nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that grew stronger each day. "Jake!" she called out, running toward him with a book clutched in her hands. Finished the whole chapter. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Jake said, unable to suppress a smile. It still amazed him how naturally the word sweetheart came when he spoke to her, how easily she'd slipped into the empty spaces of his heart. "Can you help me with this word?" she asked, pointing to a page. "Perseverance," Jake read aloud. "It means not giving up, even when things get hard." Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. "Like when you found me, and you didn't give up on me." Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion. "That's right. And like how you didn't give up, even when everything seemed impossible." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ayanna asked a question that had been weighing on Jake's mind. "Jake, why don't you have pictures of your family?" Jake had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was time. "I do have pictures," he said quietly. "I just... I put them away after your kids moved far away and my wife died. It hurt. Too much to look at them. Do you miss them?" "Every day," Jake admitted. "My son David lives in California now. He's a doctor. My daughter Emma is in New York. She's a teacher. They have their own families, their own lives. We don't talk much." Anymore. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe they miss you too." That night, after Ayanna had gone to bed, Jake found himself in the closet, pulling out a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs spanning decades: his wedding day, his children's first steps, family vacations, Christmas mornings. As he looked at them, he realized that the pain had softened into something more like wistful longing. He selected a few photos and placed them on the mantel in the living room. When Ayanna came down for breakfast the next morning, she immediately noticed them. "They look happy," she said, studying a picture of Jake with his arm around Sarah, both of them laughing at something off camera. "We were," Jake said. "Would you like to hear some stories about them over the following weeks?" Jake found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for years. He told Ayanna about Sarah's laugh, about David's determination to become a doctor after breaking his arm and being impressed by the hospital staff, about Emma's love of teaching neighborhood children to read. "They sound wonderful," Ayanna said one evening. "Do you think they'd like me?" Jake looked at this remarkable child who had somehow taught him to hope again, to feel joy in simple moments, to believe that second chances were possible. "They'd love you," he said with absolute certainty. "Just like I do." The words hung in the air between them. The first time either had spoken of love directly. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness. "I love you too, Jake," she whispered. As winter approached, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, but hadn't called in over 2 years. "David," he said when his son answered. "It's Dad. I have someone I'd like you to meet." The conversation was tentative at first, filled with the awkwardness of too much time and too little communication. But when Jake told David about Ayana, something shifted. His son's voice warmed with interest and concern. "Dad, that's Tats. Incredible. I'd love to meet her. Maybe Emma and I could come for Thanksgiving." As Jake hung up the phone, he felt Ayana's small hand slip into his. She'd been listening from the doorway, and her smile was brighter than the desert sun. "Are they really coming?" she asked. "They're really coming," Jake confirmed. That night, as Jake tucked Ayana into bed, she looked up at him with those wise, dark eyes. "Jake, do you think everything happens for a reason?" Jake considered the question carefully. "I think sometimes bad things happen that don't make sense. But I also think that sometimes, if we're lucky, something good can come from something. Bad, like me finding you? Like us finding each other," Jake corrected gently as he turned off the light. Jake Morrison realized that for the first time in 15 years, he was genuinely excited about the future. Tomorrow, he would start preparing for Thanksgiving, for the reunion with his children, for the moment when his old family would meet his new family. The lonely cowboy who had rescued a starving child had no idea that she had rescued him right back. Thanksgiving. Morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air and the promise of snow in the distant mountains. Jake stood in his kitchen, staring at the turkey he'd bought, the first one he'd cooked in 15 years. His hands shook slightly as he prepared the stuffing, not from nerves about the cooking, but from the magnitude of what this day represented. Now almost 9, and having grown several inches since her arrival, sat at the kitchen table carefully folding napkins. She'd insisted on helping with every detail of the preparation, wanting everything to be perfect for the family she'd heard so much about but never met. "Are you nervous?" she asked, noticing Jake's stillness. "A little," Jake admitted. "It's been a long time since we've all been together. But they're your children. They love you." Jake smiled at her matter-of-fact wisdom. "You're right. Sometimes I forget that love doesn't disappear just because time passes." The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway sent both of them rushing to the window. Jake's heart pounded as he saw David stepping out of a rental car, his tall frame and sandy hair so familiar, yet somehow different. Behind him, Emma emerged from the passenger seat, her auburn hair caught in the wind, her face scanning the house with barely contained emotion. "They're here," Ayana whispered, suddenly shy. Jake opened the front door, and for a moment, father and children simply stared at each other across the years of silence. Then Emma broke into a run, crossing the porch in quick steps and throwing her arms around her father. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I've missed you so much." David joined them, his embrace just as fierce. "We should have come sooner," he said. "I'm sorry we stayed away so long." Jake felt his own eyes burning. "I'm sorry too. I should have called, should have tried harder to stay connected." When they finally separated, Jake turned to Ayana, who was hanging back uncertainly. "David, Emma, I'd like you to meet Ijana." "Ijana, these are my children." Emma immediately crouched down to Ayana's level, her teacher's instincts kicking in. "Hello, Ayana. Your dad has told us so much about you." Ayana's eyes widened. "He called me your dad." "He did," David said, smiling. "And from what he's told us, you're pretty amazing." Throughout the afternoon, Jake watched in wonder as his family came together in ways he'd never dared hope. David, despite his busy medical practice, sat patiently with Ayana as she showed him her collection of desert rocks, listening intently. As she explained the geological formations she'd learned about from library books. Emma, meanwhile, was enchanted by Ayana's drawings and stories. "You have real talent," she said, examining a detailed sketch of thunder. "Have you ever thought about art classes?" "Jake says maybe when I'm older," Ayana replied. "But he's teaching me about ranching and horses first." As they sat down to dinner, Jake looked around the table at faces illuminated by candlelight, and felt a completeness he hadn't experienced in years. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter, stories, and the comfortable banter of family. "Dad," David said during a lull, "I have to ask, what made you decide to take in Ayanna? I mean, you'd been alone for so long." Jake glanced at Ayanna, who was listening intently. "I found her when she needed help," he said simply. "But if I'm being honest, I think she found me when I needed help too." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. Jake set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. "After your mother died, and you two moved away to start your lives, I guess I just ... stopped living. I was going through the motions, but I wasn't really alive. Then this little girl shows up, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. A reason to hope again." Ayanna reached over and took his hand. "Jake saved my life," she said quietly. "But he doesn't know that he saved his own life too." The table fell silent, everyone moved by the simple truth of her words. Later that evening, as Ayanna was getting ready for bed, Emma knocked on her door. "Can I come in?" "Of course," Ayanna said, sitting on her bed. Emma sat beside her, pulling out a small wrapped package. "I brought you something." Ayanna carefully unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal. "It's for writing your stories," Emma explained. "Dad told me you love to read, and I thought maybe you'd like to try writing too." "Thank you," Ayanna said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Emma, can I ask you something? Anything? Why did you and David stop visiting Jake? He gets so sad sometimes when he thinks about you." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "After Mom died, Dad became so quiet, so distant. We tried to help, but he seemed to push us away. Eventually, we thought maybe he was better off alone." "We were wrong. He wasn't better off alone," Ayanna said with certainty. "Nobody's better off alone." "You're very wise for someone so young," Emma said, hugging her. "I'm glad you found each other." The next morning, as David and Emma prepared to leave, Jake felt the old, familiar tightness in his chest, the fear of being left alone again. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. "We'll call every week," David promised, "and we'll visit again soon." "Maybe for Christmas? I'd like that," Jake said. "We'd like that." Emma hugged Ayanna tightly. "You take care of our Dad, okay?" "I will," Ayanna promised, "and he'll take care of me." As the car pulled away, Jake and Ayanna stood on the porch, waving until it disappeared. Then Jake felt Ayanna's hand slip into his. "Are you sad they're leaving?" she asked. Jake considered the question, a little, "But I'm not afraid anymore. No, they'll be back, and I know we'll be okay until they are. Because we have each other." "Because we have each other," Jake confirmed. That night, Ayanna sat at her desk, writing in her new journal, the words flowing as easily as if she were speaking them aloud. "Today, I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and choice, and the people who show up when you need them most. Jake showed up for me when I was lost, and I showed up for him when he was lost too. Now we're found, and we're never going to be lost again." As the months passed, the phone calls with David and Emma became a weekly ritual. Plans were made for Christmas, and then Easter, and then summer visits. The house that had been silent for so long was filled with laughter, plans, and the sound of a family rebuilding itself. Jake Morrison had rescued a starving child, but in doing so, he had rescued himself from a life of isolation and grief. And Ayanna, the little girl who had lost everything, had found something precious in return. A father who would love her unconditionally, and a family that would always have room for one more. 20-3 years had passed since that scorching desert day when Jake Morrison first found Ayanna. The ranch looked different now, more prosperous, with new buildings and updated equipment. But the heart of it remained the same. The weathered ranch house, the old oak tree, and the sense of home that had been built one day at a time. Jake, now 85, moved more slowly but with the same quiet determination that had defined his life. His hair was completely white, his hands more gnarled from arthritis, but his eyes still held the same warmth they'd developed the day he'd chosen to care for a lost child. He stood on the porch, watching the news on his phone with a mixture of pride and amazement. The headline read, "Native American environmental lawyer wins landmark case against Pipeline Corporation." The accompanying photo showed a confident woman in a sharp business suit standing outside the Supreme Court. Her dark hair pulled back, professionally, her eyes holding the same depth they'd had as a child, but now filled with power and purpose. Ayanna Morrison White Eagle had become everything Jake had dreamed she could be, and more. After graduating valedictorian from high school, she'd earned a full scholarship to Stanford University, where she'd studied environmental law and Native American studies. She'd gone on to Harvard Law School, then spent the first part of her career working for a prestigious firm in Washington, D.C., but 5 years ago, she'd made a decision that surprised everyone except Jake. She'd left her lucrative position to become a public interest lawyer, fighting for environmental protection and Native American rights. The case she'd just won was enormous. A $2.3 billion settlement against a major corporation that had illegally dumped toxic waste on reservation lands. More importantly, it had established a legal precedent that would protect Native American territories for generations to come. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. "Coming home tonight. Have something important to tell you? Love you, Dad." The word Dad still made his heart skip a beat, even after all these years. He'd legally adopted Ayanna when she was 12, and she'd chosen to hyphenate her name, honoring both her heritage and her chosen family. The day the adoption was finalized had been one of the happiest of his life. As evening approached, Jake heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He walked to the door, moving carefully but steadily. When he opened it, there she was, his daughter, his pride and joy, looking every inch the successful lawyer she'd become, but with the same warm smile that had lit up his world for over 2 decades. "Dad," Ayanna said, embracing him gently. At 31, she was strong and confident. But she was always careful with him now, aware of his age and the arthritis that had slowed him down. "I saw the news," Jake said, pulling back to look at her. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. I couldn't have done it without everything you taught me," she replied, "about perseverance, about standing up for what's right, about never giving up." On People, they sat on the porch as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors Jake remembered from that first day he'd found her. Ayanna had changed into jeans and a simple blouse, looking more like the girl who'd grown up on this ranch than the powerful lawyer who'd just taken on corporate America and won. "You said you had something important to tell me," Jake said. Ayanna took a deep breath. "I've been offered a position. The president wants to nominate me for a federal judgeship. If confirmed, I'd be the youngest Native American woman ever appointed." To the federal bench, Jake felt his chest swell with pride. "That's incredible, Ayanna. You'd be perfect for it." "There's more," she continued. "They want me to head up a new environmental justice initiative. It would mean overseeing cases that protect vulnerable communities from corporate pollution and environmental racism." "It sounds like everything you've worked for," Jake said. "It is. But Dad, I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without you. That day you found me, when you could have just called social services and walked away, you chose to see me as worthy of love and investment. You chose to believe in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Jake felt tears prick his eyes. "You were always extraordinary, Ayanna. I just provided the stable ground for you to grow." "You did more than that," she said, reaching for his weathered hand. "You showed me what it means to be a man of character. You taught me that strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the most reliable. You showed me that love is a choice you make every single day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Ayanna spoke again. "I've been thinking about something lately, about how our stories intersect with other people's stories in ways we don't always realize at the time." "What do you mean?" "I mean, that day you found me, you thought you were just helping a lost child. But you were actually changing the course of history. The case I just won will protect thousands of Native American families from environmental poisoning. The precedent we set will influence law for decades, and it all started with a lonely cowboy who chose compassion over convenience." Jake shook his head. "You did all that, sweetheart? You fought those battles. You won those cases. But I could only fight them because you gave me the foundation to stand on. You saved my life, literally. But you also saved my future, and the future of all the people I've been able to help." As the night deepened, they talked about everything. Jake's health better than expected for his age. Ayanna's work challenging but fulfilling the family. David had become a renowned surgeon, Emma had written a best-selling book about education reform, and both had children who adored their grandpa Jake. "I have something for you," Ayanna said, pulling out a small wrapped package. Jake opened. If to find a silver picture frame containing a photograph he'd never seen before. It showed him and Ayanna on her law school graduation day, both beaming with pride and joy. Emma took this, Ayanna explained. "I had it enlarged and framed because I wanted you to have a reminder of what you helped create." Jake stared at the photograph, seeing himself through Ayanna's eyes, not as an old man who'd stumbled through life, but as someone who had made a difference, who had mattered. "You know what I see when I look at this picture?" Ayanna asked. "What I see? A man who chose love over loneliness, hope over despair, and faith over fear. I see a man who understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up for someone who needs us." Jake felt a lifetime of emotions welling up in his chest. "And I see a woman who took every opportunity I gave her and turned it into something beautiful. I see someone who never forgot where she came from, but refused to let it limit where she could go." "We saved each other," Ayanna said simply. "Yes," Jake agreed. "We did." As they prepared to go inside, Ayanna turned to Jake one more time. "Dad, I want you to know that no matter how high I rise, no matter what positions I hold or cases I win, the thing I'm most proud of is being your daughter." Jake Morrison, the lonely cowboy who had once thought his best days were behind him, smiled as he looked at this remarkable woman who had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. "And I'm most proud of being your father," he said. They walked into the house together, the old cowboy and the federal judge, side by side. Not as relics of a broken past, but as living proof of what love, resilience, and quiet courage can create. He walked with a slight limp now, the weight of the years tugging gently at his frame, but there was a light in his eyes that time had never dimmed. She walked tall, with purpose and pride, her black robes trailing the dust of the road that had once nearly claimed her life. He had saved her when the world turned its back. She had spent her life saving others because she refused to do the same. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and memory. The walls, aged and cracked in places, held more than warmth. They held echoes of lullabies hummed beside the fire, of whispered prayers on sleepless nights, of hard-won laughter and the silence of shared pain. As the door closed behind them, the soft creak of wood under their boots was the sound of history settling, not as an ending, but as a pause. Outside, the desert wind stirred the sagebrush, rustling like distant applause, as if the land itself acknowledged their return. It carried the scent of earth, baked by sun and softened by twilight, and with it, the unspoken promise of tomorrow's possibilities. The story had come full circle, but circles, after all, have no end. What began as a simple act of mercy, beneath a burning sky, had rippled outward, changing not only to lives, but many. It would continue, in every case, Ayanna argued, in every voice she lifted in defense of the voiceless, in every unjust law she challenged, and in every barrier she shattered in courtrooms once closed to people like her. It would continue in the children who saw her and dared to dream bigger, in the families she reunited. In the systems she reformed with fierce tenderness and unstoppable will. But even beyond the public victories and accolades, the story would endure in the quiet spaces, in early morning coffees shared over newsprint and silence, in the rhythm of old boots tapping on porchwood, in the glances that said more than words ever could. It would live in the quiet joy of two people who had no need to explain the road they'd walked to get here, in the comfort of a daughter knowing her worth was never in question, and of a father knowing his love had not been forgotten. It was not a story written for fame or fortune or fanfare. It was a story of quiet revolutions, the kind that don't make front pages, but live forever in the way we choose to treat one another. It was about what happens when one man, weary and alone, chooses not to look away, when he stops on a dusty road and offers water, shelter, and something far more powerful, belief. Because sometimes the most lasting revolutions don't begin in thunder or fire. They begin in silence, in kindness, in a hand reaching down to lift someone up, in a choice, small, unseen, and impossibly human, to love when it would be easier to walk away. And long after the headlines faded, long after the robes were hung in the back of a closet and the boots rested quietly beside a worn wooden door, their legacy would remain not etched in marble, not displayed in museums or history books, but sown into the invisible soil of human lives. It would live not in monuments or medals, but in the softened voices of children, no longer afraid, in the firm hands of young lawyers inspired to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, in the tired eyes of mothers who, because of I, no longer had to choose between survival and dignity. Their story would echo in courtroom rulings and community halls, in shelter homes and foster programs, in late-night phone calls from one social worker to another. Just do what Judge Gray would have done, and it would be told in whispers too, in living rooms, in long car rides, in bedtime stories passed from parent to child. Stories that didn't begin with "once upon a time," but with something simpler, more powerful. Let me tell you about someone who didn't give up. Their legacy was not grand in the traditional sense. It wasn't about empire or empire building. It was about repair, about redemption, about a bond forged in silence and dust, nourished over decades not by obligation, but by choice. And in a world that often forgets what real strength looks like, their quiet, stubborn tenderness became a kind of revolution all its own. In the end, it wasn't the title of federal judge or the legend of the cowboy that mattered most. It wasn't the black robe or the Stetson hat. It wasn't the courtroom victories or the long, hard rides across desert land. Those were only symbols, honorable, yes, but never the full truth. The truth was what lived between them, a shared heartbeat across time and loss, a trust that had been earned, not demanded, a love that never needed to be spoken aloud to be real. Because once, under a sky too vast to measure, too sacred for noise, a man with nothing offered everything he had, and a child with no name, no voice, no place to belong, found the start of a home in that gesture, and from that beginning, fragile and humble, something extraordinary had grown. Not just a life rebuilt, but a world reimagined, a vision of justice with a human face, a vision of strength with a tender center, a vision of legacy that had nothing to do with bloodlines, and everything to do with choice. And in that home, that quiet, imperfect, fiercely loved home, the world, without announcement or permission, quietly, irrevocably, changed forever.